Turkey. Tayac, legally Philip Sheridan Proctor, was a Piscataway Indian leader and herbal doctor. He was notable in Native American activism for tribal and cultural revival in the 20th century. He had some knowledge of the Piscataway language and was consulted by the Algonquian linguist Ives Goddard, as well as Julian Granberry. Career: Proctor was a Native American activist who had served during World War I and also worked for the Internal Revenue Service. His activism spanned many decades. Background: a combination of factors had influenced the descendants of the Piscataway and other tribes in the southeast. The tribe had been decimated by the early 18th century by infectious disease and warfare with other tribes and the colonists. They had lost the land through colonial encroachment. The last mention in historical records was at a 1793 conference in Detroit. Remaining Piscataway in Maryland merged with other tribes. Others intermarried with both white and black neighbors and assimilated to various degrees. The legacy of slavery and the post-Reconstruction environment had led to 19th-century legislation across the South creating racial segregation and more rigid binary classifications of society into white and black, the latter essentially meaning all other. With states' enforcement of the one-drop rule, anyone with discernible African ancestry was classified as Negro, mulatto, or black, thereby discounting any other ancestry. Although a few families identified as Piscataway Indians into the early 20th century, prevailing racist attitudes tended to classify mixed-race people as black. Throughout most of the 19th century, the U.S. Census had no provision for classification of Indians. Census takers might classify them as free people of color, or mulatto, or black. The loss of information about Native American individuals added to the perception that the tribes and people had faded away. Maryland dissolved the Native American reservations it had assigned in the 18th century. State and federal census records classified the Piscataway and any mixed-race people as free Negro or mulatto, adding to the breakdown of identity. While the Piscataway were enumerated as mulattoes in state and federal census records, Catholic parish records and ethnographic reports continued to identify certain families as Indian. In the 20th century, social scientists studied the Wesorts to see if there were remnants of Native American culture. They were so distinct as a group that they sat together in the local Catholic church between the whites and the blacks, in a time of public segregation. Recognizing the unique heritage and the fact that some communities had married within to maintain cultural identity, sociologists called such groups triracial isolates, identifying numerous such communities across the South. Rise to leadership. Turkey. Tayac fought in World War I in France as a part of the Rainbow Division, originally made up of National Guard units to mobilize quickly. He was nearly killed by mustard gas. In 1911, in an article on the Piscataway tribe, the Catholic Encyclopedia noted that a few contemporary people who claimed to be Piscataway were Negro mongrels. This was an indication of how prominently the society used race to define identity. Under racial segregation and application of the one-drop rule, the states defined being of African descent as overriding other ancestry in the binary system. Turkey. Tayac was a notable figure in the early and mid-20th century cultural revitalization movements among remnant Southeastern Native American communities, including the Lumbee, Nanticoke, and Powhatan Indians of the Atlantic coastal plain. Their efforts were curtailed by the Great Depression and World War II. Under the Federal Indian Reorganization Act, persons wanting to register as one of the Native American tribes had to prove a certain amount of descent related to individuals on the Dawes rolls, a requirement known as blood quantum. Tayac started using a new name as he organized a movement for Native American peoples that privileged self-ascriptive forms of identification. In one of the projects in the 1960s, the Piscataway issued identification cards to Native Americans, rather than have tribes apply to and rely on state and federal bureaucracies to issue them on their behalf. Cultural reclamation. Along with his tribal responsibilities, Tayac was also an active participant in the Bonus Army, part of his dedication to seeking social justice. Tayac was a Roman Catholic throughout his life, and was active in the Catholic Veterans of America. Tayac was interviewed by ethnographers, including T. Dale Stewart, John Harrington, Frank G. Speck, William H. Gilbert, and Lucille Street, who studied evidence for Native American survival in regions where it was thought that Native Americans had long since vanished. Tayac was particularly concerned with Moyawan, also called the Akoki Creek site. The archaeological site shows indigenous human habitation from about 1300 CE to 1630 CE, including the time of the historic Piscataway. It was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1966 and is located within Piscataway Park, part of the national park system administered by the National Park Service. Some of the land had been purchased in 1928 by Henry and Alice Ferguson from Philip Proctor's mother and her second husband, after his father had died. After Alice died in 1951, Ferguson established the Alice Ferguson Foundation to protect the environment. In the 1960s, the foundation made plans to donate much of the property to the National Park Service for protection. It is across the Potomac River from Mount Vernon. Other property, known as the Hard Bargain Farm, is run by the Ferguson Foundation. Tayac supported the formation in the 1960s of Piscataway National Park. The rise of the American Indian movement in the 1970s increased interest in Tayac's attempts to reorganize the tribe. Along with his son Billy Redwing Tayac and Avery Lewis, a Pima supporter, in 1974 Tayac incorporated a non-profit organization, the Piscataway Conoy Indians. Eventually, the Piscataway Conoy Indians opened the Piscataway Indian Center. They wanted to use it as a place to revitalize American Indian identity for people of Piscataway heritage, and for others of Native American descent in the region. In 1978, Tayac was diagnosed with leukemia. His family worked with congressional and Senate representatives to gain permission for Proctor to be buried at the park. Senator Paul Sarbanes attached an amendment to unrelated legislation to achieve this. It was opposed by the Alice Ferguson Foundation, which had donated land for the park. In 1979, Tayac was buried in the ossuary site at Moyawan. Since 1978, the Piscataway have divided into 3 organized groups, strong enough to take different directions. On Monday, January 9, 2012, all 3 groups were granted recognition by the state of Maryland. None has yet been recognized officially by the federal government.